Thank you all for letting me speak here. This is such a great conference, and I particularly like coming after that session, although I'm absolutely terrified I'm going to be an example in your slides next year. So I'm going to cover off sort of end-to-end how we went about collecting user consent or allowing users to control preferences for whether we train on their data. And this is specifically training our AI products, which I know is a bit of a sensitive topic for a lot of people, certainly for our customers. And I imagine a lot of you and your organizations are facing this. But first, what's Canva? Canva's a graphic design tool. You use it for documents, slides, social media posts. This is made in Canva. And it really focuses on empowering the world to design by making design simpler, by making the tools simpler for everyday people to do this. And a major challenge to this mission is securing the data that we need to build the AI-powered tools that our customers expect. And I'm not just talking about the flashy generative AI stuff, even the humble background remover, optimizing our search for stock media, the really simple stuff. Under the hood, it's all using AI. And if we don't have the kind of diverse data that represents our community, then the tools are not going to behave the way they should for that community, especially in the smaller groups. So to create the best experience for those users, we need that unique and diverse data set. And for us, that's a bit over 200 million active users in over 100 countries. I think we might be in 180 jurisdictions now. So shout out to our legal team who tries to manage that mess. Now, this huge group of users is also diverse within these countries because we have professional designers, we have teachers and education professionals, we have marketing departments of enterprises, and mums and dads making birthday invitations. And every one of those groups has different needs, concerns, risks, and we really need to acknowledge this as the diversity of the problem space and maybe be a little bit humble in thinking we're not going to get it right for everyone, but we definitely don't want a one-size-fits-none approach where we just address the mean where there's no one actually there. There's no 50% women in our user set, as an example. Now, coming to design these preferences and controls, really no one can do their best work, best creative work, if they don't feel safe and empowered. And if you're creating IP as your job, the idea that the tool you're using is going to steal your creative identity is going to undermine that and make the tool, frankly, useless. So we need to give these users high-quality protections for their data and be really carefully considered about how we do this and how we trade off commercial and user objectives. We also needed to factor in the time of the launch. So I'm talking about this today in 2025, but we kicked off this project at the start of 2023. And a lot of perspectives, a lot of community sentiment about AI has changed drastically over that period. And we had to design both for that moment, but also maybe the 2 or 3 years afterwards, because users, apart from the people in this room, don't regularly go to privacy settings and play with them. They do it once, and that has to last. So we decided to undertake a large number of user testing sessions, a lot of workshops. We're really fortunate at Canva. We have a very engaged user group. They want to get involved. They want to help create products with us. They want to shape the product. And to meet them, we ended up going between, I think, 5 different toggles and 1 toggle and everywhere in between. We ended up splitting it in 2. So on one side, we have what we call our general usage and activity. And this is fonts, colors, search queries. This is behavior, how you interact with the product. And in our testing, this seemed to align with user expectations. Things like a search engine should always get better by looking at how it's used, even whether it's AI or not. But on the other side, we have our content. And this is perhaps a little bit more sensitive. This is the designs and the creative output of our users. And by having 2 separate toggles or 2 separate controls, that allowed us to meet 3 different user groups. The all-in, I want AI, I want it the best, I want it to work every day and be better and better and better. The all-out, I want nothing to do with you ever, don't touch my data. And what we hoped was a large middle ground of people who have become accustomed to this kind of improvement and they want the product to work, but they're not quite comfortable yet with their IP for various reasons. And I'll get into those reasons later if anyone's interested. But we did extensive user testing of every piece of this. Not only the breakdown of the two preferences, but the language used on the screens. Single buttons for opt-in, opt-out, or toggles that you flick backwards and forwards, like at the bottom of the screen here. Turns out users have really strong opinions about toggles. Now, there's a little video here, but we put this pretty front and center on our settings page, just a couple of clicks off the standard editor that every user uses. And we went for this approach mostly for the feedback, for the real-time reversibility, that users could click it, see it goes on, and then they could immediately click it back if they had any regrets or they weren't sure. And surprisingly, just that little moment gives users a lot of sense that they haven't, thrown everything out, they've committed, the end user agreement, you click agree, it's the last time you ever see it. These little things, the simple navigation, the simple control, really resonated. Now, we went for in-context prompts as well. Now, in-context is pretty broad because users are not training models, but things like when you give a feedback request saying this isn't working really well, or just in loading screens when you're downloading a document, giving people a reminder. And we tested lots of different language in those moments to see what would resonate. And we found the really simple stuff, like, can we use your data to train AI, worked incredibly well compared to the kind of emojis and glitter kind of language that we see in a lot of calls to action. Now, designing that customer experience, getting those surfaces right was great, but the critical work came after that. And that was, how do we build this for everyone else? Because there is no point collecting consent if we don't honor it. And a company like Canva has hundreds of models under the hood. That's a lot of places to get it wrong. So we began with the data scientist or machine learning engineer and did a bit of a human-centered approach to this. Now, in this little very, very simplified model, we have our poor data scientist, and compliance is on their shoulders. We use a term called brand at Canva, but it kind of means like your product or your workspace. Like, I'm an education person or I'm an enterprise person. We need that information because obviously they've got different rules attached to them, different exclusion criteria, then the user preferences, and then the regulators from all those 100+ jurisdictions we're in. And this data scientist has to work all that out, then go through our ML dataset service, which is our access control layer for data. This is putting an enormous load on their shoulders. And if your company relies on every data scientist being an expert in compliance to get compliance right, you're probably accepting a large % of failure, especially across hundreds of data scientists, if you're fortunate enough to have them. And then when you introduce a second data scientist to the story, building a second model, and a third one, it quickly gets out of control. This really doesn't scale. And every time a regulator changes or we launch a new product, every future data scientist, but every past data scientist has to go update their flow. They have to know how that works. They have to maintain all of it. At this moment, we kind of take a second and pause. When dealing with humans, or even lawyers, sometimes that doesn't play as well at IAPP. Sometimes we forget to think like engineers. When you look at this diagram, if this was a system diagram, if these were all systems, not people and not concepts, you would immediately say we're missing an interface. We need to abstract away some complexity. We need some reusable components. Simple stuff, first-year engineering. And that's what we did. We introduced the privacy preference service, which is the darling of my team. I'm fortunate enough to have an engineering team at Canva who runs this. I hope everyone listening to this is running a company and can decide to invest in that, because it is such a gift having central engineers to do this. Now, we built this service, and you'll see it sits behind the data access layer, not in front. It doesn't actually talk to the data scientist anymore. The data scientist now doesn't have to know any of these things. We're not relying on them. They just say, I want the data. And the data platform does the heavy lifting. And in this case, they just ask us, and we hide all that complexity even from the data access layer. Now, in this service, We house about 1,000 rules. So this product or this country should have an override or a default value. We house all those user preferences, but we do a lot of other stuff under the hood as well. Now, this service has about 14 billion preferences in it today. After the initial 2 that we were talking about for the 2 different training preferences, we quickly scaled. I think we're up to 16 now for each customer. And we have about 9 million messages under the hood being exchanged every day to say that customer subscribed to a new product. Are those rules still valid? Are the values still valid? Or the user opted into this. And we've built this into our product. So we actually have 30,000 checks per second now before we collect data. Did this user opt into the purpose we're going to use it for? Because if they haven't, just don't collect it. And we've actually found the biggest return on investment has been that saving in data collection costs in the front end, which was not originally on the plan at all. We also sync all of this into the warehouse. And this was one of the biggest challenges we had between the front-end use cases where you might need a 50 millisecond or 100 millisecond response time for individual users doing things, and the huge batch processing for training a model where you want 500 million data points. And we found that syncing the data into the warehouse, separating our absolutely critical in-product user experience and having that just in the service, and saying, you know what, we can accept a little bit of delay, maybe an hour, maybe a day for the sync, for those big ones and have them on the back end, massively resolved the technical complexity and allowed us to scale a bit faster. We're also at a point now where we can change one of those 1,000 rules. Maybe we launch a new product and we decide for our 16 different toggles which ones are off, which ones are on in which countries. We can roll that out in about an hour of engineering time now to all of that 250 million or 200 million users. I just left this in for reference if anyone wants to have a look. This is kind of how it works under the hood. But I'll share these slides afterwards and hit me on Slack. I'll give you a better version if you want to get right into the tech. So finally, how do we enforce this? Our ecosystem, as I said, has sort of over 100 models already running. And we found that by putting this behind the access control layer that data scientists were already using, they actually had a 0 change out of the box. The most important thing for them was to go check their model still worked and remove a lot of the filters they had before because they were now redundant. And in removing them, a lot of the time they found, actually, maybe that wasn't quite doing what it was meant to do. And you start resolving incidents before they become incidents in that way. The second bit was for new users. And frankly, this was my focus. I was more interested in the new models because the old ones will get deprecated eventually on their own and will converge on a good state. But how do we make sure there's no new fires? The biggest win we had here was not to build a new section of our handbook about privacy and consent, and not to write a new policy, and not to update our privacy training for all engineers every year to say if you use data, go check preferences. It was to find where the engineers were getting data today. Where were the instructions? You got a grad engineer, just started. They go to the handbook. Section 3, you get access to data. Now in there, in step 3, it says, here's the snippet of code to use to join with our table or to call our API in their language, in their platform. And that meant investing up front in getting the data on every platform. And I'll say that was probably the second biggest win here, that we saw no first mover penalties to other teams because we already got the data there. And for those who have been through that work before, that's often where you have the compromises and the really awful outcomes. So takeaways, putting the users in control had a massive positive response here. And I'd encourage you to do the user research and speak to your communities. Don't assume they're the same as mine. I don't even assume mine are the same as they were yesterday. Get the simplest path possible for engineers. And in our case, not even having them involved is about as simple as it gets. Get availability everywhere. Really spend the time, even if it means fewer preferences or less performance, investing the time to get it into all of those places where your engineers already are will pay dividends. And finally, evidence. We've got end-to-end visibility now when the user opts in and when the services check consent, all in one place. And yeah, it's awful in our space when you can't count the incidents you avoid, but we've had enough near misses now that we've been able to see in these audit trails when things break down before anything goes wrong. And that's probably been the second biggest payoff. With that, thank you very much.